Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever and of course, whenever you're joining me. So pleased that you've decided to take some time out of your busy schedule today to come and spend some time with us. Today's session, Back to Earth with a Bump. Let's explore performance management practice in 2022. Now, clearly today's topic, that of performance management in 2022, is one that hopefully most of you will identify as being of core interest to us here at ClearReview. In fact, this is the third year that we've published an annual report on the state of performance management practice. I have to say, watching the evolution of performance management over the years has certainly made for a very interesting journey for myself. As progressively throughout the years that we've been doing this, we've watched the world move away from outdated annual objective cycles, uncomfortable appraisals, and all that comes with it, and towards fully continuous modern performance management. And consistently throughout the years that we've been publishing this report, we've been seeing progressive moves forwards, supported by the design, the popularity and the rollout of continuous performance management systems. Now, in today's session, we're going to explore the latest version of the performance management report, which has just been released. We'll explore some of the key themes that have emerged from this report and asking ourselves some key questions. And I'm delighted that I'm going to be joined today by some very special guests. So you get the luxury of it not just being me talking all day. And I'm going to introduce those guests in a moment. Hopefully you can see them on the screen. But just before we get going, just a couple of pointers. Obviously, this is a session to talk about the findings of the latest ClearReview Performance Management Report. You can find a copy of that report in the main dashboard. At 27 pages, it's the most in-depth work that we've done based on fully original research. I mean, there has, after all, been quite a lot going on. But it's well worth a read. And today we're really going to scratch the surface of some of the things and the themes that we've identified. So if you want to know more, it's a great place to start. Secondly, you'll find a Q&A box on the screen. If at any point during this session you've got any questions for me or indeed for any of our panelists, please do drop them in the box and we'll try to answer them later on. If we don't get to them, and I'm try to keep myself strict on time, then we will come back to you later on as soon as we can. So let's start with a few introductions. My name's Nick Gallimore, and I am Director of Talent Transformation and Insight here at ClearReview. And for those of you who don't know the full background, we at ClearReview are performance management experts, founded in 2017, setting out on a mission to change and disrupt the world of performance management by designing a solution based around a central goal of helping individuals actually develop and improve their performance. Now, as I said, I'm delighted to be joined by three very special guests today. Firstly, would like to welcome Gary Beggs, Talent Development Partner at Ted Baker. I'm sure most of you have heard of Ted Baker, obviously a very famous luxury retailer. Also by Claire Ross, Head of Culture and Engagement at Advanced. Advanced are the parent company of ClearReview, one of the UK's largest software companies, 2,500 employees based here in the UK. And last but by no means least, by David Donaldson, who is Performance and Development Manager at Ishida, a manufacturer of production line solutions. And thank you guys so much for joining us today. And I have to say, and I'll just highlight this for the audience, it's so great to have a representation on a session like this from very different types of companies, from luxury retail to computer software to manufacturing. And I think one of the things that we'll dive into today is that when we think about performance management, we quite often focus on that kind of archetypal desk-based worker. But actually, what I think one of the really interesting areas to explore today is how to what performance management means to other types of worker. And I'm really looking forward to the perspectives on that in particular. So just before we get into the detail and start a conversation, which I hope proves truly insightful for the audience. I'm just going to take a few minutes just to talk a little bit about some of the detail and some of the high-level themes that are coming out of the piece of research that we've just done. Obviously, 2021 was I guess, a uniquely challenging year to be in HR. It's probably not controversial for me to say that. If you think back to when we started the year, many of us were starting a second year in this kind of forced remote working environment where that was possible. I can't help but reflect that we had probably a once in a generation opportunity as we've emerged through that to really encourage our leaders and our organizations to rethink and rework many of the core principles of how we organize work. It's been an opportunity to transform the people experience in a way many of us in HR may never have thought possible. But the question that I've got, and I think the big question that comes out of the research that we've done, is to what extent are we making the most of that opportunity? To what extent can we say work as we emerge, as we walk into the workplace of the future, to what extent can we say that that is better than it was before for the individual? Because there are lots of reasons to expect, I think, that it would be better. Remote working, for example, which for so long was, as I like to say, policied out behind things like flexible work requests, most of which set against the belief that those people who were working at home risked being less productive than those in the office. So obviously, in front and center of this opportunity, but getting it right has not been easy. How do you drive performance, culture, productivity in a remote or partially remote setting? What are the right expectations to set? And of course, there's that hanging question of what is the future of our office spaces? What's the purpose and the role of an office? One thing that is for sure, though, is that this opening up, the removal of the barriers that parts of the workforce, I've stressed that, have had around remote working. So the removal of that perception that remote working is difficult or impossible has changed people's expectations. During those initial lockdowns, protracted period living with restrictions, many of us rebalanced our lives, either through necessity because we had to, or to benefit in some way from the extra flexibility that remote working affords us. And all of that obviously adds up to a change of expectations. And of course, as organizations showed their hands and their policies on flexible working, and as life began to creep back towards what it used to be, I don't like to say towards normal, no such thing as normal, many of us, as that happened, voted with our feet. And obviously the hot topic that we'll spend a tiny amount of time talking about today, but I promise not too much, the hot topic at the end of 2021 was this so-called Great Resignation that many of our organizations were grappling with. Probably, I think, the most significant and prolonged period of sustained talent movement in living memory, and one which came at a time when arguably our organizations were least equipped to deal with it. Now, it's that shift of power that's driving the Great Resignation, which I think represents our biggest opportunity. As I said earlier, it's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to build a people experience for the new age, working environments which are truly flexible with empowered, aligned, happy people, happy teams. But the question, the big question is, are we taking that opportunity? Some of the things that we found in the report, in the work we've done, make that question, I think, even more powerful, because of course the efforts that have been required to keep the wheels turning as we've been through this period of time have been huge. Quickly rolling out new systems to support remote working, grappling with the knock-on impact of the pandemic on our people and of course on the business has naturally taken our focus elsewhere. And with all of that happening and all of the challenges thrown at leaders and HR departments, you have to wonder whether it's been possible for us to really focus on deliberately designing that people experience. And of course, I'm biased, but my biggest passion in life is the concept of performance and performance management. And with teams and individuals working in different ways, never before have our processes, in my view, around how we set goals, how we give feedback, how we drive wider performance principles, how encouraging connection between managers and employees has never been so important. And according, probably the biggest theme that you'll see in our latest report is suggests that many organisations have found themselves in that latter category of being forced to focus on the operational. Probably the key, I guess, headline finding is that 65% of HR directors say the focus on performance management in their organisation has had to move to the back burner in 2021, I should say. Now, on one hand, given the opportunity that we've got, that might come as a surprise, but equally, on the other hand, maybe it doesn't. After all, you start thinking about performance management generally, and you're starting to think about, as I mentioned earlier, annual objective setting cycles, performance appraisals, processes which frankly nobody really likes and people struggle to engage with. And you could argue that that type of process was unlikely to have been agile enough to deliver value in such volatile times. And managers and leaders are likely to prioritize other activities, often seeing performance management as a form of tick box exercise with little to no value. But if that is indeed what's happening, you do have to ask, at what cost? As people continue to adapt to remote working and as pressure on headcount increases, that shift away from performance leads to some of the other major themes that we're seeing in the report. The first really is it leads to a loss of connection between manager and employee. Managers and employees are becoming less connected, not more. It's a key call out, and we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail today. That loss of clarity, that loss of a sense of recognition, that loss of focus on feedback culture, combined with, you would argue, that loss of connection with your manager, creates, quite frankly, the perfect environment for burnout. As our people, without that structure and clarity, without that clear link to their manager, start to feel the need to work for longer with less focus and with less connection to their manager. And as our research reveals, our people have ended up doing more work than ever. 84% of people agree that burnout right now is a huge issue, and that's, I think, quite a frightening number. And last, but by no means least, the other key theme really that we can draw from the work that we've done is around this idea of productivity. And we'd like to think, given how we started this session, that switch to remote working, that unlocking of flexibility should lead to an improvement in productivity. Well, actually, one of the things that we found, and we'll talk about this as well today, is that remote working might not be making us more productive. We might not be as productive as we think they are. So it's against this kind of high burnout, high turnover, low productivity backdrop that we're all entering 2022, which I think surely must be a year where culture is king, where we renew the focus on tools, technologies, and processes that are focused on helping our people to be more productive, to work less, and to feel better in the new world. That opportunity is still there. It's still there for us to run at. But the question is how. So obviously you can read a lot more about this, these themes in the report. But for now, what I really want to do is to dive into some of these themes in more detail. And I'm going to invite my guests in to discuss these themes and to try to shed light on what we can do next, how we can move ourselves forward. Now, I'm going to start actually just by, because I think it's a useful lens, given that we've got some really interesting organizations with us today. I'm going to start just by challenging some of the things that I've just said. So, and I promise, I know we're all pretty tired, I think, of talking about this great resignation thing, but nevertheless, I think that's a good place for us to start. So, I'm just going to explore some of our panel's experiences and thoughts around this area. So, Gary, I'm going to come to you first, if I may, and as I said earlier, thank you so much for joining us today. Just on this concept of the Great Resignation, this is obviously, I think we've moved beyond the point of questioning whether it's a real thing now. or certainly based on the conversations that I have, what do you believe are the real underlying causes of this phenomenon? What's really going on?
Thanks, Nick. So obviously a nice big question for us to start with. I think, it'd be quite obvious to anyone there's probably a real good variety of factors in play. I think one of the original factors that we saw initially, sort of during periods of lockdown, was people taking advantage of whether it's furlough or that shift to remote working to really start to reevaluate and sort of refocus on, what are they looking for from a role or from a career, and potentially just reevaluate some of the particulars of that employer-employee relationship. Again, there's factors such as lack of adequate childcare. That's been a real it's been an absolute reality for a lot of people with that shift, and obviously the reoccurrence potentially of children not being able to be in school, and the flexibility being afforded by employers, or in some cases, a lack of, has caused people to need to change roles, and as you said earlier, to vote with their feet in that way. What was really interesting when when we were speaking about this, I think it's really tempting to imagine that it's a predominantly millennial cohort, because stereotypes would tell us that people that fall within that category would generally expect a lot more out of that employer-employee relationship. But I've been reading some things recently to say there's a good proportion of mid-career employees that are also leaving, so people who fall within that sort of 30 to 45 age bracket. Now, some of that actually could be being driven by them having more choice, because employers are looking to bring people on starting from a remote working standpoint, so don't have the luxury of being able to bring people in who might not have the same level of experience. So there is a lot more freedom in the market there for those mid-career employees to have a choice of roles. I think looking specifically at the industry that I work in, it's those frontline employees within hospitality, retail, healthcare that I think, to an extent, we've absolutely all been through the ringer over the past 18 to 24 months. But a lot of those frontline workers have really felt the pressure, felt the restrictions, and been subject to a lot more of a sort of volatile environment in terms of, how they work, and being forced, for want of a better word, to work with large groups of people. So there's understandably probably still some anxiety there in terms of being so public facing. So probably not answered your question definitively there, but a few different sort of ideas for us to think about in terms of what might be driving that.
Yeah, I think that's kind of super interesting, actually, Gary. And I think, as I said earlier on, certainly one of the things that I observe when I look at and I read and I listen to people talking about the Great Resignation is there is this perception that it is largely driven by opportunistic behaviour by people who work in offices, who are adapting to this opportunity that flexible working and remote working offers. But actually, where we really see talent challenges surfacing is often on the front line, and actually it's very easy for us, I think, to forget that actually much of this is systemic. It's about the fundamental changes to the way the world operates, and to the relative challenges that different industries have. So super interesting. One thing I've seen is that I've seen people framing, and I've just talked about this. I've just given the big speech about the once in the kind of once in a generation opportunity, and I've also seen people talking about it's not a great resignation, it's a great reset, a great re-engagement. And I've just talked about how we've that represents this opportunity to reframe our relationships with work so we're happier and healthier. I'm sure that resonates with most of us, but obviously that that one of the things that we're finding in the work that we've done is that people are more burned out than ever. We're more tired and fatigued than ever. So, David, coming to you, if I may, do you think what's your view? This opportunity we've got, are we in your eyes on the verge of meaningful change, or actually do you think what we're doing here is we're kind of sleepwalking back to normal? Does back to work mean going backwards
I think it's very interesting, Gary. I wouldn't want to put it in terms of a linear, where we're going to stride forward on a great reset. We give that a grand name, and it sounds like a great revolution that's going to happen, and we're all going to be different come by the summer. I think great revolutions don't happen, or if they do, they're going to be very messy. And I think that I don't think we're going to go back, but I think I'm trying to get my metaphors right. But I think it's like a pendulum where we were work practices for those who are remote working and working from home came all of a sudden, and whoever writes the narrative about, as you just alluded to, about who is it who's actually setting this narrative, because there's a huge swathes of our working colleagues didn't have that experience, had different experiences, which I'm sure we'll explore. But when we're setting that narrative, we reflect back to before the pandemic, where what was already happening. More and more organizations were embracing flexibility. We're looking at remote working from home. It was a gradual, and for a lot of people, too slow a process. That got accelerated by the pandemic, and people saw the opportunity and felt they could demonstrate that they would be productive at home. I was one of those people. I felt that I can demonstrate that I can sit in this office and work from home and be as productive. But it wasn't working from home, in my opinion. It was finding a different environment in which to work while we survive a pandemic. So to draw the direct comparison between the two, I think is unfortunate, as I think if we're basing the future of work on the lessons learned, when a lot of people, whether the role suited it or not, were, let's be right, forced, as I think you said, forced into remote working. That's not a collaborative, well planned out, this is our opportunity to develop this more flexible approach. So to answer the question, I think, no, we're not going backwards, we're not sleepwalking backwards. I think my experience, the organizations I deal with, is that we're now taking a considered and planned approach. There's always going to be some resistance to it. It's just cultural resistance. But what I see is that, and I come from private sector manufacturing, that it's almost taking a breath. It's very difficult, what with Brexit and with ships getting themselves stuck in the Suez Canal and microchips not being available. There's a lot of work going on again that's affecting the operations. But in manufacturing, taking a breath and saying, what's the best way forward? Because yes, some of my colleagues will say, I'm not as productive at home. The business will say, it's not as productive if people aren't in the office. Some roles, some other roles. Does an intelligent and caring employer want to throw a blanket across businesses and just say, are their colleagues, all right, we're all back in the office? No, you take your time to work out what's best. But there is the need to ensure business productivity and efficiency. Because if you don't know that, you can be working from home, you might not be working at all if the business goes under. So you've got to ensure that things are planned out. So I would say it's not going back, Gary, it's taking stock. And now we've come out of the chaos. Out of crisis comes opportunity. Now we're coming out of the crisis. We need to take the opportunity. But decent leaders are going to be saying, right then, what's best for the individual? What's the best for the teams? What's best for the business? If you can rush into that decision, you're a fantastic leader. But I think it's better to take a measured, data-driven approach to it, and taking into account the welfare of one's colleagues.
Yeah, I think you said something really, really interesting, actually, Dave. I think if you think about where what's happened, and you use the word surviving, that quick pivot, that quick period of change. Which I think McKinsey called the quickening, like 10 years of transformation that we crammed into like 30 days at the beginning of the pandemic. That was, we did that in order to design a business to survive the pandemic. We didn't do that in order to design a business that would address the needs of our people on a long-term basis. We didn't even know what the long-term basis meant. And I think that's the heart of the opportunity that we've got right now is to go back and almost do that piece of solutionizing and to deliberately design the way that the workplace feels and lives and breathes for people. So super interesting. Thank you for that. Now, just because I like to be honest with the audience, I'm going to try and jump in and out of slides. So if you see me looking around, I'm just very honestly, people, just always trying to find the right button on Zoom. So if I do that, that's what I'm doing. I want to go and talk about burnout for a moment. Obviously, this is the second major theme of our report, and I'm just going to dive in a little bit more into what we've found and the kind of questions that we ask in the report around burnout, because we specifically asked this question around with a link to performance management, and I think I said earlier on, for me, it's not it's too simplistic for me to argue that a lack of focus on performance management means people haven't got the clarity, which means people are more likely to get burned out. That's a very simplistic way of thinking, but we wanted to frame this question in this way, and what we found is that 84% of people at least agreed with the statement that I feel employee burnout is a major issue that needs to be addressed using performance management. So now what we've traditionally found in historic reports is that when we asked particularly senior people leaders about the fundamental question of what is the main focus of your performance management process, most of the time in historic reports, it's been around actually developing performance. What we found this year is slightly different, and actually it's moved, that focus has moved slightly towards trying to address the engagement and burnout issue, which I think is really interesting. Now, I'm going to bring Claire in, if I may, if I just try and find the right buttons to stop that, because Claire, I know that burnout is something you and I have talked about before, and obviously it's as we've just talked about, it's this challenge that I think we all agree it needs to be addressed. If we're supposedly then at the heart or somewhere on this journey towards a revolution, as Dave's just called it, a great reset, whatever we want to call it, and if we're on that journey to making work better, think about how, in theory, flexible and remote working should improve work-life balance. How is it in your view that actually burnout has become such a huge and prevalent challenge?
So for me, I think, and Gary spoke to this a little bit, of we're not just experiencing this change of work in a vacuum. It's not just about work and the way that we work. The pandemic has also impacted our whole experience as human beings. So whether it's homeschooling, whether it's not seeing a friend, not seeing a family member for multiple years, that's the weirdest time of our life, quite frankly, isn't it? So we've got to bear in mind that the level to which you can perform within a role and the level to which a business can expect output from employees isn't just on the basis of how you set work up. There's other stuff going on in the mix as well. So I think we really need to consider, and the word that I play around with our leadership team it's the fatigue of that ongoing impact. Because you can deal with work being a bit volatile and some changes, and we're remote, now we're not, maybe we're partially remote, we're a bit hybrid. But if you've also got, can I see my family this week, or what's the latest guidance around how I walk into a shop or a pub or what have you, there's lots going on there. And I think that impact affects your emotion, it impacts your physical resilience. And for me, it's whether people can hit the reset button. So never mind whether companies are hitting the reset button, as individuals, are we doing that? I think, Dave, you touched on that around, caring about the well-being of our individuals. That goes hand in hand with performance for me. And I'm obviously going to say that being in a culture and engagement role, but, we need to think about how we can encourage people to get a bit of restoration. So bringing in new tech and bringing in new ways of working that enables people to work in a different way, that's absolutely given us some competitive advantage. That's given us the opportunity to do more. But what we haven't necessarily done is stop and said, what do we stop doing? Because we can do more, we can work in a different way, but then people are just getting stacked on and stacked on and stacked on. So it's great that we've got more creativity now, but we equally need to think about, if it was just a mindset of, I can do this for a 3-month lockdown, now it's a 6-month lockdown, or now I'm going to work from home indefinitely. Like, how does that go on, and what's the toll that it takes on you? So I think for me, that balance of home, remote working, or just different days of work, different ways of working, depending on your industry, it's balancing that out with the healthy habits, the healthy practices that we can see within organisations. So if your leaders are working evenings and weekends to get stuff done, that's probably going to be the expectation that's set of employees. And when they take annual leave, can they actually take proper annual leave where they are switching off and hitting that restoration? And, you know, that's been a challenge for a lot of us. We haven't necessarily been able to get abroad to have that switch off of leaving the laptop at home. If they've gone away in the UK, it's probably been quite busy and quite traumatic to have a trip away in the UK. So when you combine that with the fact that you probably haven't been able to do the hobbies that you enjoy doing or the social activities that you enjoy doing, work becomes the thing. You're working. If you've got children, you're homeschooling as well, or worrying about the next test and whether they're going to be able to go into school. And then what do we buffer that with? Is it just work and sleep? Because you need that balance to be able to restore. So I think performance is absolutely going to be something that we think about in terms of how much a team is performing and whether that's going to drive them to burnout. But equally, the balance of well-being has got to be that you have a bit of that restoration. And I think that's the thing that we're trying to think about. And I think that might be why some of the results say, you know, HR professionals are shifting the focus away from performance management, is because actually they might have not had the attention on some of those other bits around wellbeing and restoration before, and that now becomes important. So I think you can't just think hybrid, remote working, different ways of working are going to be beneficial without addressing the whole experience somebody's going through.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I think that again, that language is just you've just used. It's, you know, the if you think about everything that we've all been through, there's that sudden emergence of burnout and well-being as being, you know, an obvious area for us to put a lot of time and investment, particularly as we went through that huge change. So I think I absolutely agree with you that I don't, you know, what I don't think, I don't hear this from the organisations that we talk to. I don't think anyone thinks performance management isn't important anymore. I just, you know, I think naturally our eyes have had to be drawn to things, you know, to things like that. Now, interestingly, just off the back of that, actually, if you dig a little bit deeper, and I encourage the audience to you know, obviously download the report and have a look at this. And I'm going to come back to this point later on, but if you dig a little bit deeper into this, there's some interesting stats around the kind of manager and employee kind of relationship and kind of disconnection. Because 48% of the people that we asked say, and I don't know how I feel about this yet, they say that their manager isn't helping them avoid burnout. And I don't know how I feel about that, because I don't know quite where we should expect the accountability lines to be drawn, right? But nevertheless, actually that translates into 51% of people saying that they would consider leaving to go somewhere where they were better supported. And that kind of leads me to ask a question of really what's come first. If people started to leave the organization because they're burned out, or actually has the impact of people leaving and people change and the pressure that brings on workload, is that actually what's driving the burnout? And Gary, I'm going to throw that one. I know it's a bit of a curveball, but I'll throw that one at you, if I may.
Oh, absolutely. And you know, building on what Claire touched on there, I think the factors that we've seen sort of contributing to that burnout epidemic, they could well have been bubbling on the surface for a good while, and we're just sort of going unchecked in terms of those, you know, potentially less helpful working practices that we all have, in terms of, you know, not being able to switch off, or, you know, doing the wrong thing for the right reason, in terms of letting work encroach into your personal life in that way. And again, you know, using the metaphor that I touched on earlier, it's been that opportunity where we're in such unfamiliar territory, providing a bit of a moment of clarity to sort of reevaluate and sort of say, hang on, what is this doing for me in the long run? I think, again, building on what Claire said, there have been elements of what we've all experienced over the last 2 years that have created a bit of a perfect storm in terms of things that can lead us to not being the best mental health. So whether that is that social isolation, generalized anxiety from the pandemic itself, you know, not being able to connect with family and friends, you know, not knowing what tomorrow holds. In some cases, you know, job uncertainty as well, depending on the industry that people are working in. So they would have definitely gone some way to contributing to that level of burnout as well. I think really interestingly, whilst there's been elements of office working that I think, we definitely haven't missed. A lot of people cite, the long commutes. I think we were talking about it the other day. None of us are missing that hour and a half, 2 hour commute into the office. I think one of the things that we might have not realized we've missed so much is just that general day-to-day social buffer of being in an environment with other people. So I think whilst those causes have been bubbling under, they've really been put under the spotlight and really exacerbated by what we've seen over the last 2 years. I think a lot of those well-cited sort of main causes of burnout, whether it's workload, perceived lack of control, a lack of reward or recognition, values mismatch, they've generally just been part and parcel of how we've all been forced to work over the last 2 years, and I think that goes across industries. Really interestingly, on what we sort of touched on earlier was around how we can replenish and how we can refill that cup and have that buffer in terms of switching off on what we can actually do, because a lot of our hobbies have been curtailed there, so there's been less opportunity to avoid that burnout. I mean, one of the ways that I think when we were all initially sort of locked down, we were using technology a lot more, whether that was all watching the same shows on Netflix, or whether it was different sort of games or apps becoming really popular. One of the main causes for that burnout in terms of that always on mentality and that connectivity, we were also trying to use the same thing to escape from that and to replenish. And I think that's something that has again just caused this to snowball a little bit, in that there has been that distinction between work life, home life in terms of physical environment, but also how we were spending our free time. It's only with retrospect that we're going to see that. But I think it's really interesting that those, the technology or the products that we would use to switch off are actually keeping us switched on.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really interesting point, actually, Gary. And I think it reminds me of something I heard, someone say to me just the other day, and back to that point that we talked about earlier around how, we didn't design some of these working models to really focus on the people experience. We designed them to survive the pandemic. But actually where we've ended up is that, it's not working from home, it's living at work. And there's that, I think that's a theme that many people I talk to kind of resonates with. And actually now I think we're starting to see organizations try to find a way of unpicking that. And I still have this challenge on a personal level of I'm never quite sure when my working day is done, and we've all found that, and that feeling of not getting on a train at the end of the day, or whatever it is you do. So anyway, I'm very mindful of time, and this is I have a feeling we could probably talk for 3 hours. So I'm gonna speed up just a touch, and I'm going to also call out that we've had actually some really interesting questions come in from the audience. So I'm going to try and weave some of those questions in as we go. But just before I do, Dave, I'm going to ask you one more question about burnout, because I think it's an important one. I think, and again, I've touched on this earlier. I think there's a tendency when we think about these things, and obviously we're talking really around even the piece I've just talked around living at work. There is a tendency, I think, for us to consider burnout a problem for people who work behind a desk and they're paid an annual salary.
Yeah.
What's your view? And is burnout a wider issue than that? And what's driving, I guess, burnout that our hourly or daily paid deskless workers are equally grappling with?
Well, thanks, Gary. And obviously, coming from manufacturing, we have a very varied workforce. I'm conscious of time, and you'll be glad to hear that what Gary and Claire were saying, I can just say the same. That the impacts on people working at homes, it can happen to people for very similar reasons. If I'll use it, say assembly, or you're a service engineer, or you haven't got a desk and you're doing more, you're working the track like I've done on a distribution, whatever it might be. But as humans, we're hot wired for patterns. of behaviours, of environments, so that we can cope. So if I use an example of, say, an assembly technician who is February before lockdown, was used to starting a shift at a certain time, having a break with his colleagues at a certain time, or he or she might finish at a certain time, catch the bus to and from work, and know what they're doing. Yeah. All of a sudden, within a week, you're starting a different time. It's not safe to go on a bus. We're changing shift times to mitigate against any risk. We can't have people sit together too closely at break times, because all of a sudden we have to keep social distancing and keep people safe, and people are really worried about being safe, because they're saying colleagues and they're saying family members and friends are being told it's not safe to go into the workplace, so you're going to work from home. And yet other people have said, but we really need you to go into work. So you've got added anxiety around that. The narrative, I have to say, to be fair, the predominant part of our conversation has been about working from home. So I'm glad that I get the opportunity to stick up for those who weren't, because the narrative in the media, on the television, is and in webinars such as this, has been the impact of working from home. And I think, is there a danger sometimes we forget that impact, that those people who had the issues I said about having the work patterns disrupted, their anxiety about their safety, they don't get a reset either, because they go home and they can't do what they want to do. I like fishing. I couldn't go fishing during lockdown. That's my switch off. But to sit on my own bed, it's a sad hobby, I know. But and so they weren't able to go for holidays. Our colleagues have exactly the same inability to reset and refresh and charge and take that deep breath. So all that we've discussed is correct, but we just need to take that and put it in a different context and realize that we owe great gratitude as well to while we concentrate on working from home, those people who carried on the battle and carrying on that work with the added anxiety of putting themselves at risk. That can't be understated.
No, I couldn't agree more. I think one of the legacies that I hope we have of the experience that we've been through is that the constant reminder of just how fundamentally important the operational workforce is and continues to be, and this opportunity that we've got around people experience has to put those people in who are out in the field, who are doing those roles. They have to be front and center for me. It's how do we think about their employee experience, and equally, that's if you think about where you see the issues around talent availability in particular really surfacing and in a really kind of visible and actually quite serious way is in those sectors. So I think, as we've said earlier on, I really hope that we can broaden the conversation, because I completely agree with you, David. It often feels when we're thinking about these things that we're thinking about that we're predominantly talking about the office as a way forward. So now what I'm going to try to do is not ask you a question that's about the office, but I have an awful feeling that's probably where naturally I'm heading, because I think one of the other things that has really come out of the report that we're publishing is around this idea of productivity, and again the one of the things that we explored in the research we've done is how productive we feel we are. And I think there's a really interesting, hopefully I've shared it correctly, I've pressed all the right buttons on the screen. I think one of the really interesting things that we found, and we asked the same question to people leaders, to managers, and to employees around how productive they feel remote working is. So there you go, Dave. I am dragging us straight back onto remote working. You need to keep me honest on that moving forwards. But interestingly, we found that 76% of HR directors believe that this remote working concept makes us more productive, or at least no less productive. And 64% of managers agree, but actually that drops to 55% of employees. And I think this is fascinating. Genuinely, I think it's an interest. It leads to a lot of questions around connection, and we're going to talk about management connection in a little bit. But Gary, if I can just come to you, and I guess I'm just interested in how you interpret this. Do we just have, maybe as HR folks, have we just got kind of rose-tinted spectacles here, or is, what's your kind of interpretation of this number?
I think, to be honest, given how long that the conversation around the effectiveness of remote working could be, given how long that's been going on, you'd be forgiven a few HR professionals if they did have their rose-tinted glasses on with this. But I don't think it's necessarily the case. I think when it comes to productivity, it could well just be the case that we're looking at different measures of what being productive actually is. It could be the case that HRDs and the individuals that are potentially looking at outputs, well then, yeah, we absolutely probably are having the same level of output from home as we would be from the office, if you're looking at that in isolation. Whereas if we're looking at the amount of time taken for that output, going back to that always on mentality that we talked about earlier on, it could just be that working day is taking place over a longer period of time, and that's something that we're only going to feel really on an individual level. We all know we're probably more tempted to answer an email at 7:30, 8:30 at night when we're working from home. It is just like we say, it's that feeling of never really leaving the office. I think it's also really important to note that it would depend on the specific role, as Dave touched on earlier, that individual is doing. I know for some of the teams in our business, it's next to impossible to be as productive when working remotely, because parts of their role rely on being in the same room, whether it's the design team being together to discuss a certain product with a sample in front of them. That can be next to impossible to achieve when everyone's working remotely, because we need to be in the room, touch and feel the product. So I think it's not taking that blanket view, but being able to actually look at this on an individual level as to what does that person's productivity actually contribute to the business. Obviously makes it a little bit tricky when it comes to implementing a fair and consistent policy from a HR perspective. But I think that those individual requirements and, to an extent, preferences as well, need to go a long way into influencing that conversation when we're looking at, how productive are we when working from home.
Yeah, no, I think it's I think that's really interesting. I think I challenge, I guess, business leaders and senior HR people to really try to dig into that question, because I think, certainly in my experience, we're not. Productivity is a bit of a mysterious art, just to really get a handle and a number on it, right? So I think a lot of that question is going to be about perception, but I do wonder whether this is a symptom of, back to that kind of language, if you like, that we've designed a way of working to help us survive, and do our employees feel like, well, actually we're surviving, and we're focusing on, the work is coming to us at such intensity that naturally we're so busy with surviving that we're not getting the opportunity to be what I think people feel is productive, which is that kind of creative, forward-looking type of work. I'm going to shift the conversation on to management, and to how, and I mentioned it earlier on in the opener to this disconnect, I guess, between managers and employees that we've, or this slight loss of connection is probably a better term between managers and employees. And I'll just spin one set of stats up, but I'll just talk through this, because I think this is a fascinating discovery. So this is a question we've asked every year in our surveys around this, and it feels like a really straightforward question. We ask the same question to employees and the same question to managers: how often do you have performance-focused conversations with your manager? And interestingly, this is the lens of the employee, but actually two-thirds of the managers that we surveyed believed that they're having conversations with their teams more than once a month. So that's 66% of managers believe they're doing that. We asked the same question to employees, and actually what we're hearing is, I find this set of stats kind of a little bit alarming. That number drops to 25%. So equally, nearly 50% of employees are saying that managers have performance conversations with them twice a year or less. So managers believe that conversations are happening. Employees don't believe conversations are happening. Claire, help me unpick that one.
Oh, thanks for picking me for this one. I mean, I think this is all around the role that the leader or the manager plays in thinking about how they are surviving through the pandemic and their new ways of working. And I think a lot of our interventions of how to help train and support and develop our managers and leaders have been around trying to help them shift and be a little bit more agile in their approach. You can't just apply, as Gary was saying, that blanket approach to productivity, that blanket approach to the ways of working, because that's going to differ within organizations and then again within teams and so on. So I think we're going to have different groups of managers, right? We're going to have some managers that know the way they worked pre-pandemic, where they had that structure, they had that routine, they had the ability to send all of their team on a set shift at a set time with set breaks and set interactions. And then we've got a cohort of managers that are new to role within the past 2 years, who are trying to find their feet and their competence and their confidence in a pandemic. So I think we've got to think about the capabilities there. And then I think it's about the best practices that we set out. But the one thing that I always come back to, and if anybody's heard me on any other sessions, it's around trust and transparency. So are you being really explicitly clear within those conversations that you're having? Because if you perceive that you're having a performance conversation each time you talk about a tactical to-do list or what the work to do on today's shift is, and you think that's a performance conversation, if you're not explicitly calling it out and saying how somebody's doing, things about where you're going to have interaction points, setting a bit of a structure or a bit of an agenda about, okay, so when we come together, we're going to do a pulse check of how things are going before we get onto anything else. And yeah, it's nice to add in some of the wellbeing things and some of the personal dialogue as well. But I think sometimes managers assume that because they're focused on the productivity of their team, that comes across in their language and that it comes across in dialogue. Whereas an employee is going to go, okay, what have I just been told? That I need to do something. That isn't necessarily I need to do it better, or the way that I got to that result could have been smarter or it could have been slicker. So I think, yeah, absolutely, I can see why that would come up. I can see why that difference would come up. And I think, we've done quite a bit of work within Advance to try and help people have a good tool set to help them facilitate good conversations. But what's really important is the mindset there as well of, you can't have the same conversation with each of your 12 direct reports. It's got to be a bit fluid and think about what the individual circumstance is. To think about, do they have the trust in that format that you've set up in the conversation to be able to feel that they can say to you, I'm worried about my performance, or flip side, I think I'm brilliant, I'm ready for a next role, and then you can start to manage those expectations. And sometimes I think that's missing. If you're not set that forum for a safe space for a conversation about what's real, what's happening right now, you could very easily end up on two different pages, because the employee is going to think one thing is being said and you're trying to angle to a different one. And I think we sometimes often see people say that they would shy away from a conflict conversation or from a difficult conversation. And again, that's about us helping them with the skill set to complement that mindset and tool set. But it's just plain sad that 13% of people don't feel that they had a great conversation. And we can't just rely on an end of year appraisal conversation, which I totally wouldn't suggest or advocate for anyway. But meaningful, regular connection should mean that you get into that. So don't know whether that's answered the incredible tough question that you chucked at me, but they're my thoughts anyway.
I think you've summed it up nicely. I think what this is suggesting is that conversations are taking place, but we're calling into question, I don't like the word quality, but the how clear the purpose of that conversation is and what we're talking about. And arguably we are spending an awful lot of time talking about the operational, the tactical, what's happening now, and not enough time focusing on performance, which is really actually kind of in line with a lot of the other things we've been talking about today. And actually, Claire, I'm hoping, I'll call this out, I think there's a really nice answer to one of the questions we had in from the audience, which was asking around to what extent agile working is posing challenges to kind of traditional cyclical performance management. And I think actually you've summed it up. You've summed it up really nicely. I think I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to do two more questions. I'm going to just jump around touch. So Gary, I'm going to come to you just on this topic as well. And I haven't shared it on a visual, but the other really interesting similar kind of dichotomy that we had when we asked managers and employees the same question was around burnout. So I think I talked earlier on and I gave that that stat around 50% of employees we surveyed felt their manager didn't help them avoid burnout. But when we asked managers the same question, a whopping 97% of managers we spoke to said that they're very well, or they feel equipped to spot the signs of burnout, and actually 89% said they felt equipped to support staff with burnout. So again, it's a big disconnect. We've got managers who kind of believe that they're able to do it, and employees saying they're not. Is that the same kind of thing that it has just been called out by Claire, or is that something different?
I think it's really similar to what Claire's just discussed. I think there's always furthermore to what Claire had said, there's always, I think, this perception of, spotting the signs of burnout. It's going to be something really almost exaggerated and almost a caricature of what we see burnout as being, someone being really demotivated in quite an overt way. And I think with less sort of physical contact and being in front of each other, we lose a lot of opportunity for a lot of those sort of more informal, soft observations that might add up to paint that picture of someone potentially not being in the best place. I think as well, and some of us, probably all of us actually could attest to, the sort of the small talk element of a lot of digital meetings, I think is becoming quite fatigued as well. I think depending on people's preferences and personality, a lot of us could forgo some of that small talk that we generally would have had back at the start of being new to remote working, before every meeting that we spend 5 minutes catching up. And I think as those time pressures are increased, that's probably one of the things that's been squeezed, and unfortunately is a key opportunity to spot how is that person doing. I can't remember who it was that touched on earlier, there is that level of personal responsibility as well. So I think, to defend the managers in a way as well, it's unfair to expect your manager to come in and rescue you from burnout. We've all got a personal responsibility to ensure that our own jugs fall first. But equally, those maybe sort of unseen things that we're all doing, whether it's, sending an email at the weekend, but making it clear, I don't expect you to reply until next week. It's those sort of silent communicators of that always on mentality that I think probably are going some way to that employee perception of, that isn't helping. It might not be anything that the manager isn't doing, but it's what they're doing without realizing that really isn't helping when it comes to protecting them from burnout in terms of ways of working and working practices.
Yeah, and I think completely agree. I think there is that and needs to be that question of accountability, and how do we help and educate the employee around, as you say, filling their own jug, putting their own oxygen mask on first, or other kind of similar concepts. Dave, I'm going to come to you. Last word. I said earlier on that hopefully the legacy of all of this is the importance of the operational workforce. Straightforward question. What do you think right now are the things that we should be thinking about when it comes to the operational workforce, and how, what are the most important things that we can do to drive meaningful improvements to their people experience?
I think, and I'll make it brief because I'm conscious of time. However, a lot of thought and a lot of conversation today is around the remote working. I made my point earlier that we need to concentrate on our colleagues who are operational. But can we give the same degree of flexibility and freedom to those roles? Well, of course not. It's not. This isn't something that's been created. There's always been a divergence between different roles, between some office roles and other office roles, between operational roles, between people who are on the road and people who are on a production line, people who work in. There's always difference in roles. But for me, the key to this, and it's got to be coming back to what Gary and Claire were talking about. It's got to be about the quality of the management. And I'll finish off by saying performance management is good management, and it's giving those people their objective. It's collaboratively working and understanding what will improve their performance, not just telling them to improve their performance. And I think that on that note, I think I shall.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dave. Really appreciate it. And conscious of time, as I said, I think we could keep talking for hours. I'm not sure people want us to. We've had a couple of really interesting questions. In particular, I'll just call out really quickly. One around do we know of any organisations that have successfully split off performance management from salary review? Yes, absolutely we have, and I'm going to make sure we come back to that individual. I think it's a critical component of getting performance management right. I'd like to thank my guests so much for their time today. It's been super interesting, and I know not easy to get ready for these things. So really, really great to have you. Thank you very much for joining. And also thank you very much to our audience. If you're interested in some of the things that we've talked about today, I'll always divert you in the direction of the Clear Review Academy over at academy.clearreview.com. Completely free resource that enables you to dive into a lot of the topics that we're talking about today. But we are at the top of the hour. So thank you very much for your time today. I hope you found it interesting, and I hope to speak to you all again really soon.